Welcome to this episode. The history of Europe is often portrayed as an isolated narrative, disconnected from the rest of the world. However, a growing body of research suggests that Africa and Europe were far more intertwined than conventional histories often acknowledge. Scholars such as David Mac Ritchie, Gerald Massey, and Godfrey Higgins have argued for a deep and pervasive African presence in ancient Europe, proposing that Black Africans played a significant role in shaping the early civilizations of Europe. This presence, largely forgotten or intentionally obscured, offers a richer understanding of the development of European societies and reveals the fundamental connections between Africa and Europe that date back millennia. This video explores the arguments of these scholars and others who have documented the African presence in Europe. Through their interpretations, we can better understand how Africa's influence extended beyond its borders, contributing to the development of early European culture, governance, and spirituality. In the 19th century, David Mac Ritchie, a Scottish folklorist and historian, proposed that early populations in Britain and other parts of Europe were of African descent. In his book, Ancient and Modern Britons, 1884, Mac Ritchie argued that the original inhabitants of Britain were a dark-skinned people who were later supplanted or assimilated by lighter-skinned invaders. The earliest inhabitants of these islands were of a dark-skinned race, and they left traces of their presence not only in folklore, but in the physical characteristics of certain regions, Mac Ritchie wrote, suggesting that Britain's history has been partially obscured by later narratives. Mac Ritchie also linked the Moors, who ruled large parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, to Black Africans. He argued that these Moors were not exclusively Arab or Berber, but included a very significant number of Africans from Africa south of the Sahara. This theory challenges the traditional portrayal of the Moors as exclusively Mediterranean, and instead emphasizes the predominantly African nature of their empire. Godfrey Higgins, another 19th century scholar, advanced similar ideas in his work Anacalypsis. Higgins was particularly interested in the ancient Celts and Druids, whom he believed had African roots. He proposed that the early inhabitants of Europe, particularly the British Isles, were related to the Ethiopians or other African peoples. There is substantial evidence to suggest that the ancient Celts and Druids had direct ties to Africa, both culturally and linguistically, Higgins wrote, indicating that the spread of African influence into Europe occurred far earlier than commonly assumed. Gerald Massey, a British Egyptologist, also explored the African roots of European civilization. In his monumental work, Ancient Egypt, The Light of the World, Massey argued that the religious and philosophical systems of ancient Egypt, a civilization with clear African roots, laid the foundation for many European traditions. The myths, symbols, and rituals that we associate with early European religion were often African in origin, Massey wrote, adding that the African presence in Europe was not limited to migration, but extended to the transmission of ideas and beliefs. A significant portion of the argument for Africa's historical role in Europe focuses on the Moors, who ruled in many parts of Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, for several centuries. The traditional historical narrative often describes the Moors as Arabs or Berbers, but scholars like Mac Ritchie, Higgins, and Massey argue that the Moors were largely Black Africans. The term Moor itself, derived from the Latin Morus, has historically been used to describe dark-skinned people. In medieval European art and literature, the Moors were frequently depicted as black, further supporting the idea that they included predominantly African peoples among their ranks. Mac Ritchie in particular emphasized the African identity of the Moors, noting that historical records frequently describe them as dark-skinned. The Moors, though often described as Saracens, were in fact a diverse group, many of whom were Africans. Their influence extended not only to Spain and Portugal, but also to France, Italy, and even parts of Britain, Mac Ritchie wrote, highlighting the widespread impact of African peoples in medieval Europe. The Moors were not merely conquerors, they also played a crucial role in the intellectual and cultural development of Europe. During the period of Moorish rule in Spain, the city of Córdoba became one of the most advanced centres of learning in the world, renowned for its libraries, universities, and scholars. Many of these scholars, who were Black Africans, contributed to the preservation and expansion of knowledge in fields such as mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The Moors also introduced new agricultural techniques, architecture, and art forms that had lasting effects on European society. This African influence extended beyond Spain and Portugal. In Italy, for example, the Moors left a significant cultural imprint, particularly in Sicily. The Norman kingdom of Sicily, which flourished in the 12th century, was heavily influenced by the Moorish culture that had dominated the island for centuries. The architecture of this period, with its intricate mosaics and geometric designs, clearly reflects African and Islamic influences. Gerald Massey's work goes beyond the political and military presence of Africans in Europe, delving into the spiritual and philosophical influence of African cultures, particularly ancient Egypt, on Europe. Massey believed that many of the key religious symbols and myths that shaped early European Christianity were borrowed from African traditions. He argued that the figure of the Madonna and Child, for instance, had its roots in the Egyptian imagery of Isis and Horus. The veneration of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus in European Christianity finds its prototype in the African mother, Isis, and her child, Horus, Massey wrote, suggesting that the African contribution to European religion was foundational. Massey also explored the influence of African cosmology and mythology on European religious thought. He argued that the concept of resurrection, central to Christianity, was borrowed from the African Osirian myth, in which the god Osiris is resurrected after being killed by his brother Set. The story of Christ's resurrection is but a retelling of the much older African myth of Osiris, a myth that predated Christianity by thousands of years, Massey wrote, asserting that European religious thought was deeply indebted to African spirituality. This transmission of African religious ideas to Europe likely occurred through multiple channels. The Phoenicians, a seafaring people who traded extensively with both Africa and Europe, played a key role in spreading African religious symbols and practices to the Mediterranean and beyond. Godfrey Higgins suggested that the Phoenicians, whom he believed to have African origins, were instrumental in shaping the religious and philosophical traditions of ancient Europe. The Phoenicians, originally of African descent, were the carriers of culture and religion between Africa and Europe. In addition to the religious and cultural influence of Africa on Europe, scholars like Mac Ritchie, Higgins, and Massey have argued for a more direct African role in the development of early European civilizations. Higgins, in particular, was fascinated by the idea that the ancient Celts, who populated large parts of Europe before the Roman conquest, were related to the Ethiopians or other African peoples. He pointed to linguistic and cultural similarities between the Celts and African groups as evidence of this connection. The Celts were not a purely European people, but shared a common ancestry with the Ethiopians, a fact that is reflected in their language and mythology, Higgins wrote, suggesting that Africa's influence on Europe began much earlier than commonly thought. Higgins also argued that the early European languages, particularly those of the Celts and other pre-Roman peoples, were closely related to African and Semitic languages. This linguistic connection, he believed, pointed to a shared heritage between Africa and Europe, The similarities between the languages of ancient Europe and those of Africa suggest a common origin, likely rooted in the migrations of African peoples into Europe, Higgins wrote, challenging the traditional view of Europe as an isolated cultural entity. Massey, too, emphasized the African foundations of early European culture, particularly in the realm of philosophy and science. He argued that the great intellectual traditions of Greece and Rome were heavily influenced by African thought, particularly the teachings of Egyptian scholars. The Greeks did not invent philosophy or mathematics. They inherited these disciplines from the Africans who had been studying them for millennia, Massey wrote, citing the travels of Greek philosophers such as Pythagoras and Plato to Egypt as evidence of this transmission of knowledge. The arguments put forward by Mac Ritchie, Higgins, Massey, and others challenged the conventional narrative of European history, which often presents Europe as a self-contained civilization that developed independently of outside influence. By highlighting the African presence in Europe, these scholars reveal a more interconnected and dynamic history in which Africa played a central role. As David Mac Ritchie noted, the history of Europe cannot be fully understood without recognizing the contributions of African peoples. To deny this fact is to distort the truth of our collective past. This acknowledgement is not merely an academic exercise, but a vital step in reclaiming the true narrative of European history, one that includes the rich tapestry of African influences and contributions. The implications of recognizing this African presence in Europe extend far beyond academia. It fosters a more inclusive understanding of history, encouraging a re-evaluation of cultural identities and heritage. By embracing the African roots of European civilization, we can challenge the prevailing narratives that often marginalize or erase the contributions of Black Africans. Moreover, recognizing the interconnectedness of Africa and Europe can also inspire contemporary dialogues about race, identity, and belonging. It underscores the shared humanity that transcends geographic and cultural boundaries, reminding us that our histories are intertwined and that we all contribute to the ongoing narrative of human civilization. In conclusion, the scholarship of David Mac Ritchie, Gerald Massey, Godfrey Higgins, and others provides compelling evidence of the profound and often overlooked African presence in ancient Europe. From the contributions of the Moors to the spiritual and philosophical influences of ancient Egypt, the interconnectedness of Africa and Europe is a vital aspect of our shared history. By acknowledging and celebrating these connections, we can enrich our understanding of the past and foster a more inclusive narrative that honors the diverse contributions of all peoples to the development of civilization. In the end, it is essential to remember that history is not a static record of events, but a dynamic and evolving narrative. The stories of Africa's influence on Europe are just beginning to be told, and as we continue to explore and uncover these connections, we move closer to a more accurate and holistic understanding of our shared human history. Thanks for watching this episode. Do remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and look out for the next one on Africa's great civilizations.